This is Las Doctoras podcast with your favorite profas, Dr. Renee Limas
and Doctora Cristina Rose. Join us as we bring women and gender studies topics out of the university and onto the kitchen table.
Salud! Hello, hello.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome to
welcome
Las
back.
Doctoras podcast. We are so excited to have a guest on. Oh my gosh, I'm like,
A dear friend.
Now that my thing is up close, I'm like, I should put some glasses on. Okay.
You all from our home.
I know. I'm like, oh. Yeah, let's we're so excited to have our guest on. I feel like this season has been all the guests that we just like want to talk with. Like we're like, what do we want to talk about? I don't know, but we just want to talk to you.
We want to talk with them. Whatever
we want everybody to hear the convo. So without further ado, our guest, please introduce yourself. Welcome,
Pia.
Hey y'all, my name is Pia Schiavocampo. My pronouns are she, her. And I am a person who does a lot in the world, who's always sort of evolving. Right now, I am a partner with a small communications and marketing agency called Momentum Solutions Team. And we primarily work with nonprofits and foundations and sort of helping them to tell their stories in an ethical way and really build their capacity to be able to better serve their constituents. So that's what I've been doing for the last 7 years. And recently sort of took a pause from a blog that I had been writing and advocacy that I had been doing around body liberation and fat politics. So this is the space I'm in, is constant evolution.
Yes. A splash of Pia. I think of
that. Yes, a splash of Pia.
Yes, I love it.
Yeah.
Tell us if you want to share anything of your astrology or your ancestry.
Yeah. So astrology, I don't know a lot about it. I just know that I'm a Virgo, and I am such a Virgo. Let's see, ancestry. So in terms of my ancestry, I'm actually adopted, but my adoptive parents, who both have passed away recently, my mom's African American, my father was Sicilian, and it's interesting because I have a relationship with both my birth parents. I was able to find them after many years. So my mother is Italian and my father's African American, which is so bizarre and so weird. Like, it's so weird. I'm like, what is going on right now? So it was, when I eventually found them, it was like very affirming. And I actually was just on the East Coast and saw my bio dad and spent some time with him. So I'm learning more about my actual biological ancestry, and that has been really, really cool. Yeah.
That is so interesting, right? Like it's like it's like the ancestors knew who you needed, right?
Oh, it's so weird. Yeah, I'm so lucky though.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And then tell us, it sounds like you know some human design. We're learning. We're both generators. And I'd love to, what can you speak
What's your human design?
So my human design is I'm a manifesting generator. And so I only learned about human design when we were in our cohort together with June. And I'm super fascinated. And I had actually started a whole Instagram around it, which, because I'm a manifesting generator, I was like, oh, this was fun. Okay, now I'm over it and I'm moving on. Because that's what gens do, is like they get super passionate and then they move in like quantum leap to get things done. And then like, I've done it, I'm good, and then I'm ready to move on to the next thing. So it's helping me like really understand who I am, because all my life I feel like, especially my parents and maybe even my own self-judgment about like not always sticking to things for a long time. And now I understand that it's because this is how I was built, I was built to master a lot of things and then explore. And so, I love that. It's affirming to know that about myself.
Yeah. I imagine that kind of gave you the confirmation around letting go of mixed fat chick for a while or for now or for whatever, right? Like and moving into the
Yeah.
next phase.
Yeah,
That's so cool.
it was a long time coming, and I placed a lot of judgment on myself of like, oh, I'm abandoning this, and I'm like, you know
Mm,
what? Like, I gave it 12 years. That's a quarter of my life. Do the math. And
mhm,
so it was just kind of like, I have other things that I want to do and other things I want to say, and there are so many incredible people who are still actively
Mhm,
doing this work. I
mhm.
think it's
mhm,
always going to be a part of my identity in some way, but it just was time for something new. And, it
mhm,
was just like after my father died last year,
mhm,
I just needed that quiet time. And then I was like, yeah, I think I'm done. I'm ready to put it
Yeah,
down and it's
mhm,
okay.
mhm,
yeah.
mm.
I
None of that.
I had a few things, as you were saying that, when you were like, I gave it 12 years. And I think there's and I don't know if this is generational, but I think there's this perception that we're supposed to have either some job or some career or something that
Mm.
we just commit our whole lives to, right? And we're just
Oh,
on this path. But, both historically and especially as we go into a different, you know, future, I think that
mm,
it actually is very common for people to kind of completely switch careers many times in their
mhm,
lives. And I think as people raised by, in communities of color, and I think in working class communities, we're so used to this idea of like you get that one job and you get that one career and like you stay
you work
committed
to
to
your
that or loyal to
retirement.
them.
Mhm,
Yeah, and I think
mhm,
that that's, I read something somewhere where it's like you're supposed to have like 7 different careers in your lifetime. So
mhm,
I think
Wow.
it's great to like normalize that. And I think the truth too is that as we go into the future, those lifelong jobs don't even exist anymore. So we have to
Mhm.
kind of be willing to shift
mhm,
and pivot and like have different abilities, to do work or, and I don't mean work in a capitalist way, but um and as I
calling,
was
career, life.
calling,
Mhm,
right, and I think, so I was thinking about that, and the other thing I was thinking about, like, you as a manifesting generator, I love the affirmation, same, right, like, as for me, astrology has been so affirming because I'm a triple water sign, right, Cancer sun, Cancer moon, Pisces rising, and I'm like, "Oh, right, that's why I feel
mhm, mhm,
everything."
mhm, mhm,
And
mhm,
that's
Mhm.
why,
Mhm.
like,
mhm,
it's really hard for me to move through emotions,
mhm,
when I think there was a time when it was like, "Oh, I was just being too sensitive," or I was, whatever. And so it feels so nice to be like, "No, this is just a part of who I am, and how do I lean into that? How do I use it as a gift?" And when you're saying, like, you put a lot of effort into something, and I'm like, that's the project starter, right? Like, and I think,
mhm,
instead of seeing it as like, "Oh, I just go all in and then, move to something else," and that's why we're supposed to
mhm,
be in community, right? Because if
mhm,
you're the manifesting generator, then, the
mhm,
other people are supposed to come in, right? You're the
mhm,
idea, you're the person, like, "Here's what we're gonna do, here's how we're gonna do it. Now
mhm,
you all go do it," right? Like, that's
mhm.
your place in, and we've been talking a lot about, like, the ecosystem, right? Like, what's the
Yeah.
Mhm.
ecosystem, particularly around, like, social change and social justice, right? Like, yeah, you're the idea person, and then you're not meant to be there forever and be, you know, like doing you're meant to be like, "Okay, now what's the next idea?" Right? That we
Mhm.
can like move
Mhm.
forward. So I think it's
So
yeah.
mhm. Interesting given the Virgo-ness too, because I think with a fellow Virgo here, like, it's hard for me to let go of things. Like, I have definitely put my nose to, like, the grindstone and completed tasks. That's how I have a doctorate and everything. And looking back, I think I could have taken a pause at some point and been like, "Is that really what I wanna do?" Like, how can I what's the next thing? And so I think the gift of Renee for me is all of the emotion. And I'm feeling a similar gift with you, Pia, and, like, hearing the story of letting go of something, giving so much time, and then moving into something new. I think it's
Yeah.
gifts, truly.
And I really relate to the sensitive. I'm highly sensitive, highly
Mhm.
empathetic, intuitive, and growing up,
Mhm,
like I was always sort of made fun of for being sensitive and crying. all the time. And it wasn't until really in the last like maybe 5, maybe 10 years that I realized that my sensitivity and vulnerability are a tremendous gift, and that I wear my heart on my sleeve and I don't apologize for being sensitive, and that I'm seeing people say, I wish I had that. I wish I had even an ounce of that. And my vulnerability allows other people to be vulnerable. And that has been such an incredible gift. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting because I can be a private person, but also I'm like, I just be putting all my shit out there. Like, I fucked this up and I messed that up and I love this
That's that
today and
manifesting
tomorrow.
part, right? Yeah.
I totally hear you on the I was just thinking about this the other day, how like, Christine and I have this public platform and we do all this work, but I also really enjoy anonymity. So I do get a
Mhm,
little strange, like if we ever had like we've been recognized in certain
I mean, we're
places.
generators. I think that's part of it. Like, we're not as the manifesting, like when we see our manifestors and our manifesting generators out there, we're like,
Yeah,
that's
like
cool. We
that's
celebrate
cool.
you, but
And we're
we
like,
actually
we
want to
wanna
be able
like
to be
it's like
like
you wanna
a
kinda
mass,
be like
you
you
know?
wanna be I don't know, it's this weird, like, I just struggle with, like, I wanna keep my anonymity, but I also wanna, like, do my shit, and I am a put my shit out there kind of person too, I'm very
mhm,
transparent.
More than me.
And I love too, like you, Christina, you were talking about like what are the gifts of being in community with different types of people, and for you to say like you're unapologetic about it, like I'm working on that. Like that's really hard
mhm,
for me because I'm not I'm up the people pleaser in me is
Mhm.
like I want to be, and I think I am, I think, or at least people perceive me as this like outspoken person, but then
mhm.
I'm like outspoken and then I'm like, oh God, like oh God, did I
Well,
say
that comes
something
back to
wrong?
family
Did
of
I hurt somebody's
origin, right?
feelings?
It comes back to our family stories, Renee, for
Yeah,
sure. That's
it's
the only thing pushing that.
definitely some
Mhm.
Yeah.
trauma, and I think all that, we were talking before, we started recording about, like, what the moment that we're in and, just,
I love how
God,
you
it's
spoke
so
about Pia. You were, like, so clear. You're like, this is me. This
like,
is what's
here's where
happening."
I'm at.
I wish it
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so tell us again, where are you? Where are we? What's happening?
We're
I mean, there's just so much fuckery. I mean, and it's not like it's new fuckery, but I think it's just in this particular moment as we're entering an election year here,
Mhm,
and
mhm.
there are no good candidates, not even the one who's currently in office because
Mhm,
he's
mhm, mhm,
continuing
mhm,
to fund a genocide. Um, I, it's
mhm,
like I vacillate between like deep, deep sorrow and anger, and
mhm,
also tremendous hope when I see
mhm,
how many people across the globe are
mhm,
saying, do not do this, not in our name,
mhm,
ceasefire, stop killing
mhm,
innocent people.
mhm,
And I just feel like whenever I've been very vocal about that and allowed comments on my social media, I get a lot of pushback. And I'm like, you know what? I'm not allowing people to do that anymore because I had to school somebody. I had to school a white man on Facebook because he tried to come for me. And, he wanted to come with me with tears and talk about how, I'm sitting in the comfort of my home. I was like, trust and believe as a Black woman, I'm not sitting in comfort. You picked the wrong bitch.
Oh.
And now I have to read you for filth. So everyone else can also understand I'm not the one. So
Mhm,
now I'm mostly posting about what's happening on my
mhm.
Instagram. I turn my comments off because I'm not interested in getting into a dialogue with people who don't want to see what the truth is. For
Yeah.
me, this is about, you know, elevating the voices of people who are being killed.
Mhm,
It's not a platform for, you know, trying to convince me that this is about protecting Israel. I, as a mother and as someone who has tremendous empathy, I
Mhm.
cannot be silent. For me, I believe in that silence is violence thing. I know for a lot of people, it feels really scary to sort of like show up and say, hey, this is what I believe in. But if we don't do that, then who does?
mm,
Then who
Mhm.
is the voice? You know?
mm.
and we rely on other people to be like, oh, I'm going to speak up and I'm going to say stuff. No, you need to speak up, even if it's just in your circle, even if it's just with your family.
Mm.
I think we all have that responsibility.
Mhm.
And anybody who is a parent,
Mm.
if you're a parent, like, how do you even, there is no justification, right? And so for me, it's just like, it's holding my son closer. It
Mhm.
not looking away at the horrifying images, because it is a constant reminder that none of us are free until we are all free. I mean, I
Mhm.
do deeply, deeply believe that, you know. So yeah, I don't know. It's just day to
Yeah.
day. It's hard to be in the spirit of the holidays when you see what's happening. And it's not just in Palestine, right? We see things that are
Mm.
happening in the Congo and in so many other places, where people of color are exploited, you know. Um, it's our responsibility, period.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ugh. Oh,
Mhm.
so much so much feeling. It's I feel like every day I wake up, and even the other day, Christine and I were somewhere, and I audibly sighed. I was like, "Ugh." And she was like, "What's wrong?" Like, out of nowhere. Like, I wasn't even doing anything. I was
Mhm,
like, "Ugh." And she's like, "What's wrong?" And I was like, "Oh, no, I just," like,
The
I'll
weight of
be
the world,
present
the
in
weight of
in a
it.
moment of something, and then I'll get a flash of like, "Oh, right, we're living
mm,
in a fucked up world." And
Mhm.
I get upset because it's so hard to be in the present moment with
Mhm.
joy,
yeah.
when in the background there's so much destruction and violence and, all
Mhm,
these things. And so it's like this
Mm.
it's just this like juxtaposition, and like, how do you, I don't know. It makes it very difficult to like,
mhm,
be like, "Oh, happy," and like, "Oh, but,"
yeah.
across the like, it's a ve I don't even know how to do that, and so it's every morning,
Mhm.
like, I'll be able to sleep, and then I wake up and I'm like, "Okay, then have a good day," and then I'm like, "Oh, right, the
Mhm,
world
mhm,
is like," and so it hits me like a wave in the morning, and it's really hard, and, and
Mm.
that gets, like, really emotionally exhausting,
Mhm.
um,
I'm always
it
impressed that you can make it through the night, Renee, actually, because it hits me, like, in the middle of the night where I'm just, like, the weight of
mm,
feeling it.
yeah.
And I wanna figure out, I'm learning how to be a hopeful parent, like, to parent
mhm,
with hope, as
Mhm,
well as feeling in these times, and frankly, yeah, most of my adult life having, you know, even through, like, the academic lens, but studied so much of this history,
mhm,
coming to the table, like, with that reality and with hope for for my kiddo, like, it's
yeah.
yeah,
daunting.
yeah.
That's the hard part, I think, is I think I had, like, a breakdown a few weeks ago where I was like,
Mhm.
as some like, yeah, we've committed our lives' work to social justice, always with the idea of hope, right? Like, we're
Mhm,
working towards change, we're working towards something, and I think when I'm hit with a moment like this, I get very like, "What the fuck?"
mhm,
Like, where is the hope when it feels like it's just it's a harsh reality to like to be in, and then be like, "Oh, and I'm supposed to go and tell my kids like this is why we do what we do because, we're going to change
Mhm.
things," when I have worked my entire fucking life to try to change
Mm.
things,
mhm,
Mhm.
and we're still in this mess, and even worse, so yeah, I had a
That
little bit
myth
of a
of
breakdown a
progress.
couple weeks ago of like, where is the hope? How do I even look my kids in the face and say
yeah,
that hope exists when
Mm.
mhm,
I have committed my life's work to change, and it feels, it just feels like, I don't know. I'm trying not to go back into that dark place, but
mhm. It's hard because
yeah.
it's like these two truths that exist at the same time, which is that atrocity is happening all over the world all the time, you know, and also, we want to protect our children from it. And I think for me, like, the thing I struggle with, my son is 6 years old, is like, how do I even talk to him about these kinds of things? Do you know what I mean? Is he too small? Is he too innocent for me to
Mhm.
like burst his bubble that this is happening? And so I sit with that, and like I sit with children being murdered, and then I also sit with what do I owe my son, particularly at this time of year? Like I also want him to feel
Mm.
joy. I
Mhm.
want him to feel gratitude. Like both of those things are true, and that's a hard thing to really sit with. You
Mhm.
know, I don't have any answers. I have no answers.
And I don't think we need to have answers, honestly.
No.
I
I like
think just
the sitting with things. Mhm.
having this conversation out loud, I think is what so many parents are struggling with, right? Like,
Mhm,
I think exactly what you said is, what is our responsibility in this moment with our kids? Like, how do we talk about it? Do
Mhm.
we talk about
Mhm.
it?
Mhm.
What do we owe them in this time? The joy, I always think about that, right? Like, my father passed away 9 years ago. He passed away
mhm,
2 days before Thanksgiving, and I mean, I
mm,
could barely, and I had my oldest was 2, and I was pregnant with my youngest, and I remember that whole kinda holiday season, I was like, I don't know," and finally, maybe, like, 2 weeks before Christmas, I was like, maybe we should get a tree, and maybe we should,"
yeah.
and I remember at that time thinking, I don't want years from now to go back and
Mm.
be like, "Oh, that's the one Christmas I didn't do because I was, so sad," and so,
Mhm.
anyway, and thinking about that now, it's like, what are we owing them that joy? Like, I love the way you put that. And then also,
Mm.
um, yeah, being with the reality of like,
Mhm,
there's
Mhm.
going on. I will share that I thought a lot about, what is my responsibility to talk to my kids, and I do think there is a certain level of innocence and bubble that I wanna kinda hold for them. I think there is, because I think that's something that a lot of us didn't have, right? Like, our
mhm,
bubbles were burst very young,
mhm.
and without any kind of cushion,
Yeah.
right? There was no cushion
That's
for
another
it.
thing on the table, our little selves,
Right.
Mhm, mhm,
And
and growing
so
up fast.
the
Mhm.
best thing I could do was to try to talk to my kids in very simple terms
mhm,
and just say, okay, there's this thing happening, across the world, and a lot of people
Mhm.
are, and I was like, what language do I use? And I did say, I said, a lot of people are being killed, and because there's people
mhm,
in power who are making,
mhm.
really violent choices, and blah 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 blah,
Yeah,
and really try to keep it real, like, real simple, and
yeah.
also, they're not gonna sit for a whole historical lecture, you know?
Right, 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 right.
I'm, like, just trying to keep it real, like, and I said, "Do you have any questions?" And my oldest was like, "Can it happen here?" And I said, and I'm in my head, I'm like, "I don't know." "Can it
Yeah.
happen here?" Right? And so I just said, "We're safe right now, and we're gonna do everything to keep ourselves safe," and
Mhm,
I actually put it in the context of a boycott, because I've always been I've had a lot of critique around boycotts in my day, and
mhm,
I've always been very strategic in that. And so I just said, look, there will be a time when we as a family might need to make choices about where we spend our money and where we don't. And I just want you to know that when we as a family make that choice, this is why we're making that
Mm.
choice, right?
Mhm.
And
I
Mhm.
love
so they
that.
were kind of like open to that, like,
Mhm,
you
mhm.
know. So it was and it was like a not even a 10-minute conversation,
Yeah.
right? It was
Mhm,
like very like quick, and
So
then reassuring of their present safety, and
Mhm.
mhm,
and then that was it,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know.
mhm.
And, like, thinking 8 and gosh, how old is Cruz again?
Aiden
10?
and Cruz will be 11 in like a few
11.
weeks.
And I
Yeah.
have an 8-year-old too. So just thinking, like, even 6 to 8, like, that's a really big difference in age, as what we
Yeah.
talked
Mhm.
about, or
Yeah.
they're
Yeah, it
beyond aware.
is. But I do appreciate the conversation. It makes me think about, um, my mother who passed away. It's almost 3 years ago. She was also a PhD and a professor, and from a young age, I remember her talking to us about civil rights and I remember her
Mhm.
telling us a story about Emmett Till, and I might have
Mm.
been 11 or 12, and I remember how traumatized I was. Like, I was
Mm.
having nightmares, and
Mhm.
Mm.
I'm not sure if maybe the way she explained it was the best way, but what I understood or what I understand now was like she always wanted to emphasize how lucky we were, and that we
Mm,
were standing on the shoulders of people who had made a tremendous amount of sacrifice and who
mhm,
had, so much violence committed against them. And she would share things even from her own childhood.
Mhm.
She grew up in Roxbury in Boston, and she grew up in the projects, and she was very dark skinned, and she would always talk to me about the paper bag test. So for people who don't
mm,
know what the paper bag test is essentially there were a lot of sort of clubs and things for black folks, but you had to be the color of a brown paper bag or lighter. So she was
mhm,
never allowed in those spaces. So she always talked to us a lot about sort of the privilege of having light skin, which
mhm,
I think just gave me an awareness of that very, very early. And I just remember as a kid just being so devastated by that and thinking like my
mm,
mom is so awesome. Like you're so, people are
mm,
stupid for not wanting her in the club, but it was those
Mhm.
conversations shaped sort of who I am and my outlook on the world. And
Mhm.
so I just appreciate Renee that, you find the way that works to talk to your kids about it, to make it
mhm,
simple. We don't have to necessarily get into grisly details, but how can
Mhm.
we sort of like help them understand the situation and then help
Mhm.
they already know, right? They already know what's right and what's wrong.
mhm,
And
Mhm.
so and just creating that space for them to be able to ask questions and to just have that door open to conversation.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
because
that's
I
beautiful.
want him to feel safe, especially as a Black boy. I want him to feel safe. And also, let's understand that not all kids have the luxury of safety.
ugh,
So,
that's ugh,
yeah,
I
right.
think that's the constant balance, I did, what was the other kinda thing I mentioned? I mean, we're always talking about they have a sense of, like, injustice and justice. Cruz
Mhm.
is definitely an environmentalist at heart. He's always like, "I wanna plant trees," and,
Cute.
I'm like, "Oh, he's a tree hugger, like, through and through," and has that, like, sense of, climate justice without maybe even knowing, that term, but we talked a lot about too of we try to talk about like advocacy, right? And say and like I'll tell them like if you witness or see anybody,
Mhm.
saying or doing anything like, it is important that you A, not add to
Mhm.
that, right? And
Right.
Mhm.
B, kind of step in and oh, that was the thing that was hard for me because you know truly, I've never witnessed such divisiveness. I mean, I lived through a lot of, more than Trump era, more than COVID, right? Like you were saying, like you had to turn off your comment, like, the amount of divisiveness and like vitriol people just come on social media with
Yeah.
is
Mhm.
Yeah.
fucking like it's so
Yeah.
hard.
It is.
And I that was something I was mindful of as I talked to my kids too, because I didn't want them to feel like they needed to be defending anything, right? Or like, being put in a position where they have to defend any political views. And
Mhm.
so I just said, and I kind of asked them, I said, are you, that's how I started it. I was like, oh, have you heard anything? And they were like, no. And then
Mhm.
I said, well, if ever it does come up, you don't need to have that conversation. You can just come and
Mhm.
tell me and we'll talk about it, right? Like I don't want them to
Yeah.
ever feel like they need to be put in some, not that that would happen. And our kids go to a really small private school where there's conversations amongst the parents and how to like like how to hold boundaries around things like that.
Mhm.
But it's just, you just never know. And
Yeah.
so I was like also very much like, we'll talk about it as a family. You don't need to feel like you have to
Right. That
defend yourself or any,
Yeah.
they don't need to be put in that position. That was something I really wanted to be clear about, right? Like,
and that we're always here to talk with
yeah.
them. That's the thing.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest thing sometimes. And maybe that's what I didn't grow up with maybe, but yeah, like I always try to create a time in the evening where I'm like memento time, like anything that I can help you carry, anything that came up.
Oh.
You know, I was gonna say, I love, thinking of Cruz, this beautiful brown boy, right? Like in his environmentalism, it's so beautiful. And the language that I use with Jaguar is around greed. Because I think this good and bad, kind of in the narratives that he's hearing. I'm like, I think Papa, like, there's not really bad people. There are greedy people, and so wanting to move into like how do we share the resources that we have, how do we hold on to the things that are beautiful to us, and how do we hold accountable those who are like you know hoarding and taking the power, the energy, the food, the whatnot, and so in the context of what's happening in the world right now, or that's been happening forever, I guess it's just like those are pretty greedy guys, pretty greedy people.
Mhm. Mhm. Big time.
The other thing I wanted to talk about is it's come up in conversations recently is the myth of progress. You know, um, as we were talking about hope and how much we worked, and when we see all these images, and they're just out there, and it's not like they aren't happening all the time, all around the world and in the US, right? Things, different atrocities, different greedy people are everywhere,
Mhm.
but it feels just so shocking to us. And I think there is this hope that we are making the world better, and that the greedy people will eventually die off and we'll be left
Right.
with, a better world. And when someone was like, "Oh, I think that's the myth of progress," I was like, "Ooh, what do I do if there is no sense of that?" It
Mhm.
might be a colonial thought, progress.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
But is it? I don't know.
I think, we've talked about this a lot, the idea that liberation is some utopic future, right? Like
Mm,
somewhere, in the future, we will be
mhm.
liberated. And I think that what I
The Age
hold
of
on
Aquarius
to
song for some reason, I don't know
yeah,
why.
what I always think of Wakanda when I
Oh,
when I saw Black Panther. And I came out of Black Panther and I was like, "Oh, fuck," right? Because that's Afrofuturism, right? The idea, right?
Mhm.
And I was like, "Oh, fuck, they just created that utopia in like, in with film, right? Like they created that utopic future, right, in Wakanda,
Mhm.
and like and that's actually how we create liberated futures is by making it up out of nowhere, right? Like I think that's
Mhm.
actually an important part of the liberatory process is to not just dismantle all the
it's
shit,
to
but like
imagine, it's
to
to
imagine, like, okay, well,
envision.
what can it look
Mhm.
like then? And so I was to me, that was like I actually talk about that in my classes a lot. I'm like, "Look, Wakanda," right? Like, that's right?
Mhm.
Like, let's
Mhm.
use that as the beacon of hope, right? And of course, as the Marvel universe evolves, right, that's gonna get fucked, but, like, you know, but just thinking about, like, the process of the director or the writer, like, creating this place called Wakanda where it's, like, actually, protected and not in a violent way, right? It's not protected violently, right? Like, anyway, so, it was just it's an interesting thing to me, and so what I try to lean into is and it's hard because there's times when I go into the deep, dark places of my mind, and I'm like, "Fuck this,"
Mhm.
right? But I try to remind myself that liberation is not in the future or
Mhm.
just in the future, that liberation is in the here and now.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that when we are faced with such atrocities, right? It's like harder to see that, right? It's like how can you see through all of this that we are actually living into liberation? So I don't know if it's I think maybe progress is a colonial term because it is in terms of linear, right? Like things are linear,
Sure.
right? When we know that our ancestors didn't think of time in that way, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um and so I just keep thinking like, where are the moments, right? Where are the
Mhm.
moments of liberatory possibility?
Now.
And if we can
Mhm,
keep building
mhm,
more moments,
mm.
it's like we're just gonna push all this stuff out, right? And so I think
Mhm.
about what do I hold on to? When I think about the students that come into my class and they have, and this is just one example, right? When I think about myself as a young kid who was dealing with gender stuff, and the only language I had at the time was to say tomboy, right? Like when I was a young little tomboy, exploring my gender. And so when students come into my class and they have these terms like non-binary, right? And gender
Mhm.
non-conforming, I'm like, fuck, like y'all just did it. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
y'all just like you didn't wait for anybody to create this utopic future. You just fucking said it. Like this is what I am. This is who and
Yeah.
I'm gonna claim it unapologetic. To me, that's liberatory, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Whatever
Mhm.
you want to call it, it's like it's already happening. And in
Yeah.
fact,
Yeah.
that's why we're seeing such
Mm.
astonishing violence right now because it's
Mhm.
it's white supremacy,
Mhm.
colonial, it's their last
Mhm.
attempts at holding on to the structures, and we're like, "Oh,
Mhm.
no, homie."
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's it's gone, right? Like, yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think that like the difference between today versus 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago is the power of social media, which doesn't
Mm,
allow you
Mhm.
to be able to, paint a narrative that is untrue. You know what I'm saying? And
Mm.
so, I know a lot of people who are only looking at mainstream media, right? And who
Mm.
are hearing one side of the story. And I sometimes struggle to have conversations with those people where I'm like, can you please look at other sources? Like ask yourself the
mm,
question, like, why are you getting this one-sided view? Go watch some Al
Mhm.
Jazeera. Like here's people you can follow on social media so you can have a fuller understanding of what's really happening, right?
yeah,
And like you need to hear the narrative from the people who are actually being killed. Like,
yeah,
right?
that are
That would
on the
be that would
ground.
be helpful. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's the language, and what I heard you say, Renee, about like young people aren't waiting, like they just are like, this is the language that I'm creating. But I think it's powerful when we see how language has changed
Mhm,
over decades and centuries. Even the way now that we talk about enslaved Africans, where we used to say slaves, now we say enslaved, right? Because
mhm.
saying somebody is a slave is not
It's
their identity,
dehumanizing.
right? It's a
Right.
condition that was put
Mhm,
upon them. And
mhm,
so I think all of
Mhm.
that nuance is so important. And,
mhm,
the people who are like, oh, they, them, and da 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 da. And I'm like, that's because it's not about you. Like, why are you upset about having to call somebody the way that they want to be called? You need to ask
Mm.
yourself that question. Why are you
Mhm.
struggling and why are you so resistant? Like dig deeper into that. And whether it's on
mhm,
a conscious level or not, you are benefiting, right? You are
Mhm.
benefiting from white supremacy. You are benefiting from being a
Mhm.
straight white male, and it's like no one wants to really dig deep into that. I feel like after George Floyd, there was this wave of like, everybody's like reading all the books and they all want to be like DEI experts. And I'm just thinking to
mhm,
myself, like, but when it comes down to it,
Mm.
like, what are your real values? Like, how do you show up in the world? And is this just lip service? Like your Black Lives Matter sign in the front of your yard is nice and all, but at the end
Mm.
of the day, are you willing to be uncomfortable? Are you willing to give up power? Like, are
Mhm.
you, because
Mhm.
that's really
Mhm.
what it is. It's not just about
Mhm.
this sort of surface level allyship, but it requires you to make sacrifice, you
Mhm.
know? Yeah,
I
it's
wanna say
interesting.
something to that because I agree. I think, and I'll go back to some of the points you were saying, and I just wanna say something about, like, the idea of, like, I think being uncomfortable is such a thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think it's beyond just, like, being willing to be uncomfortable. It's like we don't even have infrastructure to be able to help each other be uncomfortable, right? Like, we're so used like, we don't even know how like, that it's not easy to be uncomfortable, and do we have, like, support systems so that it's like, okay, we're gonna force you to be uncomfortable, but you're not gonna be out on the ledge doing it on your own, right? Like, and not that we have to do those things, but we don't have infrastructure for that. So I think it's like it's beyond just like having people be uncomfortable. It's like giving people spaces and places to process that uncomfortability.
I mean,
I
how long have we been in therapy or in other
Right,
spaces
exactly,
in
right? Like,
order
we've all been
to be
having
okay
to
with
do
being
this
uncomfortable for a
uncomfortable
second?
fucking work,
Yeah.
and I think the other thing is, when we say things like, "What are you willing to give up and sacrifice?" And I think I think that's important, and I think it triggers people's scarcity. And so I think there's this
Mhm.
notion of like, you have to give up everything, right? Or you
Mhm.
have to sacrifice everything because there's only so much. And so I really try to think about it as like, maybe you don't actually have to give up anything, but you have to be willing to like not hoard, right? You have
Mm,
to be willing to only take your share, right? Like,
mhm.
right? Does that make sense, right? Like, because I think that I
Yeah.
think there's this like
But
scarcity
for greedy
mindset.
people who have
Yeah,
they
because I
will have
actually
to give up things, like
but that's the thing is I think that like because I've always said this, that it seems to me like when we talk about things like privilege, I see more people who are in some marginalized capacity more willing to accept their privilege than people who are at the most privilege, right? Like we can all sit here,
Yeah.
I can sit here and be like, I've got, I'm a white passing Latina, so I've got privilege, right? I'm highly educated, so I've got privilege. I'm willing to name all
Mhm.
my privileges. But those
Mhm.
white, cis, straight, rich men are not willing to even talk about privilege. And so I
Correct.
feel like we actually don't need to really give up that much because we barely
Mhm,
got there,
mhm,
right? Like, I think what we have to do is to say, like, there's enough. It's just that the
Mhm.
ultra greedy, the
mhm.
Elon Musks and
Correct.
the Jeff
Jeff
Bezos
Bezos. Yep.
and all those homies are
Mhm.
hoarding all this shit. So really, what I would say is like, okay, can you go and hold them accountable? Can we stop
Mhm,
romanticizing these fucking mofos, right? As if they're fucking
mhm.
geniuses for like
Right.
they're probably exploiting somebody else's labor, right? And they're just branding it. Like that's
100%.
all
Let's just,
Elon
you
Musk.
know what? They want to go to Mars so badly. I'm like, please, all of you get on a shuttle and go to Mars and never
Yeah.
come back. Trust and believe no one will be sad about that shit. You
Yeah.
know, it's like the amount of money that you spent on that, you could have literally taken care of every hungry person in this country. Do you
Mhm.
know? Like I can't wrap my head around that kind of
Yeah.
shit. I
Yeah.
can't. And I have
Mhm.
no tolerance for it. And also
Mhm.
I also am tired as a woman and a person of color of feeling like it's my job to hold those people accountable. I need other white people to hold you accountable. That's what I need.
Mhm. Mhm.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Mhm.
Right?
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
I need men to hold men accountable.
But you
Yeah.
know what happens? What triggers that, right? Why they don't do that. And I talk about this in my classes all the time because at the end of the semester, I'm like, all right, so what's the solutions for all this shit that we just talked about? And I do say, I said, and the few men that I have in my classes, I'll say, like, y'all need to do some shit because we are tired. We're just trying to survive the patriarchy,
Mhm,
right? Like,
mhm.
and I think what happens is that if they have to hold other men accountable, it also means they have to hold themselves accountable. Right?
Correct.
That means we have to be willing to sit with our
Mhm.
complicity in these
Mhm.
systems and sift through that mess while
Mhm.
Mhm,
also holding other people accountable. And I think that
mhm,
that's the hardest part for people, right? Is to like not
mhm.
just look at that, is to look at themselves and being like, how am I complicit in all of this? And that's the hardest part, I mean, because I've done that, right? I've been like, fuck, like have I said some shit? Have I done some shit? Right. And we're
Yeah.
human. We're human who
Mhm,
are born into this innately fucked up society, right? And so of course we're going to perpetuate some of that, right? Not, and it's okay to just admit that and then, better, you do better, right? Like and
Mhm.
but
mhm.
that's I think that's the hard. I wanted to go back to something you talked about like in 2020 when everybody was reading all the books. Which makes me laugh because I remember even then I was like, "Oh god, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how this is gonna go long term," right? Like, but recently saw something where it said like the difference between diversity, like DEI, and liberation, right? Like,
Mhm.
so the idea
Mhm.
of like diversity is like, oh, I can be in community with you. And liberation
Mhm.
is like,
Mhm.
the system is fucked.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And let's
Mhm.
change the system so
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
we don't have to have these other kinds of like, it's not just about tolerance, right? Like I'm going to
Mhm.
tolerate being in your presence, right? Or you existing,
Yeah.
but I'm actually going to make it so that, we all are equally viewed as humans and,
Mhm.
deserving of things.
Mhm.
So I wanted to kind of highlight that, right? Like the difference between
Mhm.
DEI and liberation and I
For
think that's
sure.
actually what we're seeing right now is a lot of like, oh, it wasn't just enough to
Mm.
be diverse, right? Or
Mhm.
it's not
Right.
enough. It's like, no, we have to look systemically and change the
Yeah.
system, you know.
'Cause we're free
It's
when we're all
interesting.
free, right? Kind of,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
flip that around.
I mean, I
But
think I see that a lot in my work, this notion of diversity, which is very much that checkbox thing, like, oh, okay, we've got diverse staff, right?
Mhm.
But does
Mhm.
that staff feel empowered? Does that staff feel they
Mhm.
belong?
Mhm.
Are they seen? And like that is really the difference for
Mhm.
me. And I think the other piece is just going back to what we were talking about earlier about people willing to be uncomfortable. Like white people's discomfort will never be as painful as what people of color go through every single day.
Mhm.
So I am a
Mhm.
compassionate person. I really am. And get
Yeah,
over
yeah.
it. Like your temporary discomfort is something that
Yeah.
you get to
Mhm.
turn off when you want to turn it off.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Our oppression doesn't get to switch on and off. And
Yeah.
Mhm.
so let's also understand that, right? Um, None of it
Yeah.
is easy, but I do feel hopeful in that we are finding better ways to talk about this, and we are finding better language for how to explain things.
Mhm.
Um, and I also know, like, I'm not a patient person. Like, I know I am not somebody who should be doing conflict resolution or like being able to talk to white people. And I wish I was that person sometimes, but I'm like, I'm not. And I'm okay
Yeah.
with that.
Mhm.
I'm completely and utterly okay with that. You know,
Mhm.
my father was white. And so it wasn't until later in my life that I saw the kind of racism that was happening within my own family. You know, that I was
Mm.
experiencing misogyny and I was experiencing
Mhm.
gaslighting, you know. And so, like, how do you even come to terms with shit in your own family, much less people
Mhm.
out in the world? You know, that's hard. That's really hard. You want to talk about discomfort, right? So if we can all, like you said, be willing to acknowledge that every single one of us holds privilege in some way, whether it's big or small, and then not sitting around thinking, how do I be a better ally? Bitch, go ask how you can be a better ally.
Mm.
But
Your
see, I think
signs, your rainbow signs are not it.
see, I think it's not it like I think it
Love it.
I think the flaw in allyship too is assuming that because unless you are a rich white cis man, and that's a very really that's a very small portion of the population, right?
Mhm,
And they got all the power and all the money and all the things. But unless you're that, like you are in some proximity to marginalization, right?
mhm,
And so I think again, it goes beyond allyship. It's to say, oh, my
Yeah.
marginalization comes from the same place that yours does.
Yeah.
mm,
So we're not
It's
allies.
that
We are both
relationship.
fighting the
It's
same fucking
relational.
machine,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Like
Mhm.
that to me, sometimes that's the missing part. It's like we're not
Mhm.
um fighting these separate entities, right? Like, oh, there's
right.
patriarchy and there's racism and there's,
Mhm.
homophobia. It's like it's all the same fucking
Connected.
shit.
The same
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
It's
Yeah.
all the
Mhm.
same. So,
Mhm.
if you feel, oppressed in some way, then can you see,
Mhm.
I'll give you an example, like, because this was talk about family, right? Like,
Mm.
I grew up in a family with, even though the women were the ones in power in my family, we were
Mhm,
still outnumbered by the men. So I have a lot of men cousins. Hopefully they don't listen.
Or maybe they need to listen.
Maybe they do. And it comes from a place of love. It
For
always
Christmas Eve, but, the Tamalada is coming up, so,
yes, right. So
hopefully
Christmas
they
time
listen
is always
after that.
a really interesting time because I'm trying to have it just enjoy myself, not trying to be, but a few too many shots of tequila and words are had. And there was a conversation one time and it haunts me because I think at the time I didn't have language to hold that
Mm.
conversation.
Mhm.
And so because we were talking about essentially what was happening is the oppression Olympics, right? It was my cousin who was very dark skinned and who also has disabilities, right? Was like trying to say like, that he has it worse than me as a woman, right?
Mhm.
And I was like, okay. Right,
Mhm.
like and I did try to be like, "I get it. I understand that. I understand that
Mhm.
you as a, dark brown man are gonna, be afraid of cops in a different way." Like, I completely understand, and I said, "I understand your disabilities," right? As a professor, I try to make sure that I'm aware of, the ways that I engage with students with disabilities, right? Like, and to me,
Mhm.
that was to me, what I couldn't say in the time was I am willing to see your oppressions and I'm willing to understand my privilege and then do something about that and acknowledge
Mhm.
that. What I need you to do is you as a man to
Mhm.
recognize your male privilege and to
Mhm.
do something
Mhm.
about that,
Mhm.
Mhm.
right? And to recognize that your oppression comes from the same place that mine does. And if we
Mhm.
wanna help each other out, we gotta help each other out, right? Like,
Yeah.
because he was not willing to see his male privilege. He was like, "Well,
Interesting.
I'm oppressed for being brown and you're oppressed for being a woman, so we're all good. We're on an
Right.
Right.
equal playing
Right.
field." And I was like, "Ah,
Right.
no." That's not quite
Right.
how it works because you can still perpetuate misogyny and sexism, right?
For sure.
And that's not what we want, right? Like, and so
Mhm.
it's hard, I think, to kind of see the complexities of that, right? To see like
Mhm.
we're fighting the same fucking we're not fighting each other. I'm not here to tell you I have it worse than you. I'm not here to say I have the same as you. I'm here to say, can you see me? And I'm willing
Mhm.
to see you. And can we come
Mhm.
together to work against the same machine? And that's,
Mhm.
I think, something that's hard for people. They're like, oh, I'm an ally because they don't actually see their oppression as intrinsically linked to mine.
They're just like
Yeah.
white saviors or male saviors, or there's something they're trying to be they're coming from that place, from this
Yeah.
hierarchy.
Yeah.
They're like, "Let me help you."
Mhm.
It's like, "No, help
Mhm.
yourself."
Right.
Mhm.
Let's help
Yeah.
each other help you know what I mean? Like, that's I think is like I don't know, that's the thing it's missing. It's like they see as separate. I'm like, "No, we're trying to
Mhm.
fight the same fucking, like, machine
Yeah.
here, right?" I don't know.
Mhm.
It's frustrating.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's exhausting.
It is exhausting. I mean, we've also encountered, people talking about things like cancel culture.
Oh, cancel culture. Oh, it's so dangerous. It's
Or
such a
things like
slippery slope.
yeah, because on one hand, here's what I'm gonna say. I don't know if I said
Say
this
it, girl. Say
publicly.
it.
I think cancel culture exists for historically marginalized people, right? I don't
100%.
think I don't think cancel culture exists for people in various positions of privilege, right?
Mhm.
Mhm.
And the people who are claiming cancel culture are the ones in positions that they're like, "Oh, I'm being canceled." I'm like, "What canceling has happened? Have you lost your job? Have you lost money? Have you lost opportunities? Have you
And
lost
mostly they just
respect?"
feel uncomfortable, right? That's in the end, they feel
Yeah,
uncomfortable.
and maybe
Mhm.
Right.
momentarily lose those things, right? Like, for a moment, right?
Mhm.
Because in 2020, I remember everybody was getting outed, or, the Me Too movement, right? A few
Oh,
years
yeah.
before that, right? Like, all the men were getting outed, and all the white people were getting outed. We're in 2023. What happened? They still all got jobs,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
They
100%.
they were able to recover their, reputations, all of that, right? And conversely, what we're seeing now is cancel culture for, um, critical race theory, ethnic
Right.
studies, right? Queer
Exactly.
literature, right? Like,
Mhm.
that's cancel culture, right? And that will
Yeah.
have much more longer term impacts than whatever the fuck white people think is happening to them, right?
Mhm.
So I think, like, and we've come across that, right? It's like, oh, like, how can you talk or how can you be afraid of cancel culture when, really we're just trying, like, we've been canceled
Yeah.
for forever. We're just trying, like, we're barely trying to get our histories into the, you
Mm.
know,
Mhm.
into the
100%.
curriculum,
I mean,
you
I
know?
even for me, like a recent example of that is Lizzo being canceled. Like there was so much like sort of surface support, like, oh, I love Lizzo. She's so amazing. Oh my God, she's so great. But then like one accusation comes out and it's like the fat, black, amazing singer all of a sudden is canceled. And it's
Mhm.
like,
Yeah.
even when I think about people like R. Kelly and Michael Jackson, who people knew were
Mm,
doing shit, they still continued to be
mhm.
popular. They still continued to make money. Like we have seen that happen over and over and over again. But the minute a happy, fat black woman who is successful starts to get some
Mm.
backlash, and
Mhm.
I don't know whether
Mhm.
those accusations were true or not. For me, it was so clear. It was just like clear as day. Like, yep,
It was easy to throw her under the
she's
bus.
messing up or whatever. One thing happens and all of a sudden she's
Mhm.
completely written off,
Mhm.
and I'm just thinking like there are plenty of people out there who are doing nasty, awful shit over and over and over
Yeah,
again,
yeah,
and
Mhm.
they're not getting canceled. And so I
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
that's a
Mhm.
real struggle. That's a real,
yeah,
real struggle to
yeah,
witness. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, that was
Mm.
a hard one. I remember I'm like, "What what do we
Renee
do?"
gave me the
I
lowdown. She showed me
I know.
everything.
But I have things to say about that, and I think that actually, well, I don't need to say what I think about Lizzo because I think that, I
I
think
think it's true though. I think
the
exactly what you're
the
saying,
point to what
Pia,
you're saying is that it was
around.
easy to throw her under the bus, right? It was easy to be like, "Oh,
100%.
there was no grace. There was no
No, there
grace
was
at
no grace.
all.
Mhm.
There was
None
no
at all,
grace
right?"
whatsoever.
And I think too, like, sometimes when things like that happen, I'm like, I feel a little bit like, and that's not even my community, right? Like, but I feel like, "Oh, these are intracommunal, um, things that are being
Mhm,
aired, and then it allows white people to come in and show their
Mhm.
anti-blackness and show their fat
Mhm.
phobia, right?
100%.
And, like, and all
Mhm.
those things. I mean, because 'cause we've had
Mhm.
things like that happen in our community too, where I'm like, "Oh, fuck, can't we just have, like, a
Like
Latino conversation
inside
over here?"
conversation, and then for the world, no. Yeah.
Without having
Right.
to, like, because then it makes it so much easier to be like, "Oh, well, see, all Mexicans are blah, 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 blah," right? Like,
Right.
Mhm.
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
and it's such a tricky thing to navigate, right? But
I
anyway,
wanna land I know, I get kind of in this and, we've got a lot of things going on in our personal lives, and I'm like, "Oh, this feels so hard. This conversation was good, but hard." And I'm
Mhm.
thinking again about Cruz, and I'm thinking about our children. I'm thinking about the moments, like, I just wanna lean into, like, at the end of this conversation, like, when Jaguar does something, like, and he's still, like, being, like, kind of a trickster and jokey in the middle of of a stressful situation, I'm just like, "You're my hope for the future." Like, or when
Um,
he's like, his inner magic just comes out, or when we can see them shine. It's
mm,
just in a winter spiral and seeing their personalities come out. Santos, Renee's kid hopped the spiral just out of the circle and then hopped back in and then did it. I was just so hopeful after that, just thinking our kids are uniquely
yeah,
themselves. It's
yeah.
like one of our students who are not like unapologetic. I'm non-binary. And I'm like,
Mhm.
man, that
I think
freshness.
I think
Mhm.
too, so because we have our kids in our Waldorf school, and there's it's not perfect, right? It's definitely got its own flaws. But I
Mhm.
think the thing that I really appreciate about this particular, like, pedagogical philosophy is their approach to child development, and this idea of, like, things in things presenting things to children when they're developmentally ready for them, and then hard things presenting to them at the stage that they are in, and then allow that to kind of grow, right? Like, you don't have to tell them, "Okay, slavery, like, and the atrocities of it," but you can present it in a way where they can at their age level, at their developmental level, and then you build on that versus let's just pretend like it didn't exist ever. Right? Like, and then eventually they figure it out, and that could be like a really hard moment, right? To see that, like, to have the bubble lifted, right? And I appreciate this, like child, like, understanding how do we present material to them in a child developmentally appropriate way. And I think that what that to me that helps me balance the idea of, like, because they're very much in, like, we want to hold their child innocence as long as possible. And I have pushed back on that a lot because I'm like, not everybody has access to that, right? Like, people of color don't have access to that, particularly Black kids don't have access to that. And, right, it's not but, it's not either or, it's and, right?
Yeah.
How can
Yeah.
we how can we hold on to their innocence as
Mhm.
much as possible while also presenting them with the reality of things. And so I
Mm.
always try to hold that, like, in my heart, because I think that the bubble of magic of childhood is actually the important piece that's going to get us even further into liberation, because we
Mhm.
shut their imaginations off too early. So if we
Mm.
allow them to be in their imaginary magical place, and then we slowly kind of present them with the realities of the world, they're going to be much more open to creating liberatory possibilities, because they haven't been said, oh, the world is fucked, the
Right.
reality of the world is fucked, you're going to be fucked, and that's it. It's like, no,
Right.
let them play in their unicorns and butterflies, and then be
Right.
like, siphon in, like, okay, here's how things are. And this is why I think Cruz is more, like, he doesn't like to hear about climate change, but we talk about it. And then he's like,
Yeah.
oh, but if we plant trees, we do, like, he's much more hopeful versus,
Yeah.
like, like, hopeless. And so I think
We
it's the
need them
balance
to
of,
be
like,
hopeful. And we
and
need
how
them
do we keep
to
them hopeful?
reimagine our futures. We need them to lean into being playful and lean into
Yes.
different ways of seeing the world. Because I'm a jaded bitch, like,
Exactly.
and so I don't
Exactly.
want to put that heaviness on him, you know?
Exactly.
So,
That's to me,
uh,
that's the key, is like, how do we protect that magicalness, because
mhm,
that is the
Their
key to the
vision. It's
future.
their vision that will see
that's
us
right.
into,
And we need to harness that. We need to hone that. We need to give them spaces to do that.
100%.
Um, so I think it's like, it's not all or nothing, right? It's not like, oh, we
Right.
just keep them in a bubble forever, and it's not we just tell them everything's fucked, right? It's like, how do
Right.
we, like, hold the balance between that?
Yeah.
Okay. So, as we wrap up,
Yeah,
please
thank you
tell us
so much.
where we can
Mhm.
find your work, where do you live online?
Where do I live? So, mostly on Instagram, at a splash of Pia. You'll see that right now, as I said earlier, I'm really just posting about what's happening in
Mhm.
Palestine. Usually, I am posting about personal style, interior design, or other things that sort of inspire me.
I
Um,
particularly liked you all's, hurricane updates that you did at that one point. I
Oh,
think you
yes.
shout that out.
That
I
was
think I haven't talked about it.
fabulous. That was
Yeah.
so fabulous.
that was my husband's idea. Like, he did it first, and then I was like, I want to do that too.
It was
So,
so good.
I'm wanting to lean into more playfulness,
Mhm.
and really tap into that. I've been practicing and studying improv for over 20 years, and I want to bring more of that, like, into my work, and just into the way that I operate in the world. We did a lot of yes ands today, right?
Mhm.
And allowing for there to be multiple truths and allowing for more possibility. So,
Mhm.
yeah. So, if that interests you, you can follow me or not. I'm good.
I love it. I love it.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
I'm like, I was just taking notes. I'm like, because we're always struggling to find a title for each episode, something that's, like, catchy and fun. And you
Mhm.
were talking, and I'm like, because
Jaded
something you
bitch.
said early on, you said something
Which
about
one?
fuckery. And I was like, oh my God, I
Uh-huh.
love that word, fuckery. So I was like,
Fuckery.
pos- possibility in the what?
In times of
Possibility
fuckery.
in the time of fuckery. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
Play.
That's perfect. Possibility in the time of fuckery. Like, that's a whole ass book. That's a book right there.
I love it. I love it. All
Thank you
right.
for
Well,
taking
thank
the
you,
time to join
Kia,
us. Thank
for
you for the
being
Thank
time,
you all.
here.
the
We
love,
love
all
you
of
so
it.
much. Yeah.
Thank you for
we'll
being
be
you out in the world.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you both.